the strategy of advanced temporalizing. I will talk about chickens crossing roads, hence my little. I have a confession to start with. So this is what I actually wrote when I submitted an abstract entitled Aspect in the A-B theory, and then I attached the abstract that I prepared for last year's IAPT, which was then accepted, and this is the abstract you have all seen. The paper is extremely different in the lapse of a year, so if you saw it last year, you're going to see something very different this time. But you know, given that last week I had written neither of the slides of either of the thing I intended to do or the thing I did last year, I thought I would go as a symmetry breaker with the thing that matched the abstract. But in any case, this is all on the program committee. All right, here's some problems. So I'm going to start with the modal example. So the modal principles, this is a problem for modal realists, modal reductionists of the David Lewis sort. Here's a bunch of principles that it looks like these folks are committed to, or these folks, I mean, David Lewis and maybe Gonzalo Rodriguez Pereira, these are the two folks. So at diamond, so possibly, and there's a bunch of quantifier phrases, just have to make them match up. So no, some, all, at least two, etc. F to G's is equivalent by definition to there's a world W such that at W, no, some, all, at least two F to G's. Okay, so that's the role of at W in the modal semantics. Now, Lewis accepts this, but lots of people who aren't Lewis also accept this as well, because they'll have a different view about what worlds are than Lewis's view about what worlds are. Right? So if you are some kind of worlds are maximal consistent sets of propositions or something like that, you might be very happy with at diamond because you think, yeah, it's true. Whenever it's possible that at least two F's to G's, there's a maximal consistent set of propositions according to which some F's, at least two F's to G. Okay. So the fact that Lewis accepts these is not to say that only Lewis accepts them. The T axiom, phi then diamond phi is a logical truth. Now here's the more distinctively Lewisian stuff. Something's a Lewis world if it's a spatiotemporally maximal region within which there's a particular entity in all its surroundings, right? So this is the I and all my surroundings generalized to when it's not just me, because I can imagine worlds where I'm not at. Okay, so I think everyone can accept that too. It's called Lewis worlds, but it's a theory about it's an account of what the Lewis worlds are. And everyone can agree with Lewis about what he thinks possible worlds are. They're those kinds of things. So this last one is the really distinctive one. So there's a world W such that at W phi, right, that this notion here on the left-hand side of this definition is the same guy that appears on the right-hand side of the first one. So we're going to join these together in a way that gets bad consequences. If and only if there's a Lewis world such that within it, phi, and within it means when quantification is restricted to matters about that particular maximal spatiotemporal region. Now, this combination of the first and the last, and given that this thing is at least as strong as necessary equivalence, which it really is, suffices for the idea that possibly a talking donkey exists, just in case there's a Lewis world within which there is a talking donkey. Okay. So here's a problem that lots of people have noted. Premise, at least two Lewis worlds exist. That seems to be a view of Lewis's. Possibly at least two Lewis worlds exist. That follows from the T axiom. There's a Lewis world such that at least two Lewis worlds exist within it. That follows from putting together this at diamond principle plus Lewis reductionism and the second premise there. Finally, no Lewis world contains any distinct Lewis world within it because Lewis worlds are maximal. Okay. So that looks bad, bad for Lewis. Lots of people are happy to find that things are bad for Lewis, but, you know, of course, then there's people who are just looking for an argument and will try and get out of this in various kinds of ways. So the standard kind of response, and I guess this is And there's really just one kind of response, and people articulate it in different ways, is to restrict the application of @diamond to particular kinds of sentences. And there's just disagreement in the literature about which particular sentences it is that it should be restricted to. So John Dykes thinks that it should be advanced modal sentences. So when Lewis is talking about the pluriverse, you don't apply this @diamond analysis, but when you're talking about just ordinary English, you do. Kian Dodd, Dan Marshall, guess Dan Deasy as well, maybe Brad Scow, all think that it's not so much the advanced versus the banal modal sentences, but rather qualitative versus haxiotistic sentences, whatever that's going to turn out to mean. You could think of other kind of proposals as well. So various kinds of moves that are intended to restrict the derivation of 3 from 1 and 2 by blocking the application of the semantic clause for the diamond. It's often been noted that there are lots of analogies between modal and temporal constructions, lots of analogies between the semantics of modal logic and semantics of various kinds of temporal logics. And it looks like the metaphysical pictures have analogues too, right? So you see people saying that the A-B theory dispute has some parallels with kind of reductionist, non-reductionist disputes in modality. A couple of references almost at random from a very large literature on this. So reductionist views about temporal existence, by which I'm thinking the B-theory primarily, might seem to be susceptible to an analogous kind of problem to the one that we've just seen for Lewis. So we don't have @diamond here, we have @s, where s is the sometime operator. So this looks like a plausible reductionist truth condition. Sometime, no, some, all, at least 2 F's or G's. Again, by definition, there's a time such that at that time, no, some, all, at least 2 F's or G's. And temporal reductionism being a time such that phi is, there's some maximal achronal region, and within which, you know, again, when quantifiers and matters are restricted to what's going on within that region, phi. Okay, so those 2 principles parallel the modal ones we just saw. They look to be pretty characteristic of things that, say, B-theorists want to say. They also are quite characteristic, I guess I would note, of things that some non-presentist A-theorists want to say. So if you're a moving spotlighter, you've got all these other times than the present time. Why not help yourself to them in accounting for what's true sometimes? It's what's true at one of these times that you believe exists. You're going to have to add some extra bit of ideology, maybe a bit of ideology about what's, you know, true simpliciter is what's true at one particular one of these guys. But that's not necessarily going to interfere with the semantic analysis you give of sometime or anything like that. Okay. So, sort of said this. So, reductionism typically associated with the B-theory, but all sorts of eternalists, I think, should endorse it. So here's Ted Sider, a B-theoretic eternalist, but he does not, nothing in what he says here really relies on the B-theory part as opposed to just the eternalist temporal ontology. The eternalist past and future tense claims are ultimately made true by claims that quantify over past and future times and entities. For instance, an assertion of it was the case that phi is true if and only if phi is true at some time located before that assertion. What to say about non-presentist but non-eternalist A-theories? Maybe they want to use some clause like this for the past operator, but do something else for the future. Some of them might want to use it actually for both, and then say, well, look, the non-existence of these future times gives you that there's no fact of the matter about what the future will be like. So that would be a kind of ontologically strong version of the open future. Again, you would just get that falling out from a kind of reductionism about sometimes and an anti-realism about future times. So I think that the A-theory, B-theory dispute is not captured by the eternalist, non-eternalist dispute. It's captured by really something about whether or not there's some ideology about absolute accuracy of a particular moment, as opposed to some kind of egalitarian view about all moments. But not really trying to diagnose the A-B dispute here. It's really a dispute between, but it's a problem for any view that's going to endorse these things, whether or not you turn out to be an A-theorist or a B-theorist. So here's the problem. Again, I'll just run through it, make everything explicit. At least two maximal achronal regions exist, 2 times if you want to talk in that way. That's a consequence of being not a presentist. Sometime at least 2 maximal achronal regions exist, again from the logical truth of things are around the wrong way there clearly. If I then sometimes phi, not sometimes phi then phi, would be very bad. So if that's right, then there's a maximal achronal region such that at it, there are at least 2 maximal achronal regions, but maximal needs maximal, so there aren't going to be maximal achronal regions which have other maximal achronal regions within them. So they're inconsistent. You could take this to be a reductio of non-presentist views that endorse 5, along with these other principles. All right. So lots of people have taken the B theory to be the principal target of this kind of argument, but I actually think it targets versions of the A theory as well. Or you might think it can't be that's responsible. We can't really be rejecting 5. It's got to be one of these supplementary principles which has gone awry. Okay. So something that a lot of people have argued, and this is sort of the analog of the diver's door type view, is that you should, for some sentences in particular, the advanced temporalizing sentences, sentences which are about the manifold of times, as opposed to being, in a hand-wavy way, talked about in the ordinarily from within the manifold of times, that those should not be subjected to the same semantic treatment as the ordinary ones. So here's a kind of way, at least if you're a B theorist, of getting at a motivation for thinking like this. So B theorists, on my way of understanding them, are committed to the idea that propositional truth is temporally invariant. So if you've got a proposition, if it's ever true, it's always true. I don't even think that's right. That's the right way of presenting it. It's really more that propositions should be thought of as functions from worlds to truth values. They have no, it's not like they are constant functions from worlds and times to truth value. They just don't even care about the time. They're just functions from worlds to truth values. So that's an observation about propositions. It's not an observation about sentences. So how do we get to a claim about sentences? Well, you might think there's a class of sentences that is kind of proposition-like in how it behaves. And if we look at what the B theorist says about tense, we could think about ways of identifying what that class of sentences is. So the B theorist typically wants to embrace context sensitivity as an account of how the appearance of variation in truth value over time arises, even though propositions never change their truth values over time. And that's the idea being that tense sentences express different eternally true or false propositions at different contexts of utterance or relative to different contexts of utterance. Right? So if you've got some sentence which contains some tensed-like expressions, expressions which are sensitive to the time parameter or parameters of your context, then they're not going to be the kinds of sentences that invariably express the same proposition no matter what time you evaluate them relative to. And so they're not going to be the kind of ones that you're going to think there's any redundancy for. But the others, right? If there is a class of sentences which doesn't have any context-sensitive expressions, it doesn't have any tensed apparatus in it. Tenseless sentences, right? Sentences which involve maybe, the logician's sense of is, where is not to be thought of as present, but to be thought of as is in the same way that there is and are in the same way there are 2 prime numbers less than 5 or whatever. So if you identify that, if you think about that class of sentences, the non-context sensitive ones, then you might think, well, for them, what's this tensed operator sometimes going to connect to? There's nothing in that sentence which is going to trigger any of the interesting stuff about, you know, at S, which we had before. So for that class of sentences, not for the ones which involve tensed apparatus, but for this other class which does not, sometimes it's just redundant, right? It's going to be the case that if it's true, it's sometimes true. If it's sometimes true, then it's true. You can just move smoothly from one to the other, okay? So sometimes it's a redundant operator for this class of sentences. Then the claim is the first guy on the previous slide is in this class of sentences, right? There are at least two times. That's the R of the tenseless R, not the tensed R. And so you should be able to give a kind of redundancy analysis of that, right? So, I mean, if you're a B-theorist, this way of motivating the idea that some sentences should get a particular kind of semantic treatment and other sentences should get a different kind of semantic treatment, maybe this can sort of help you get there. And here's some people who don't exactly give this argument, but give arguments in the vicinity of it. So, look, lots of smart people who I admire and respect, or even am intimidated by, give this kind of argument, but I've got some concerns about it. So first, I mean, it's obviously counterintuitive, right? So here's one clear way of bringing out this counterintuitiveness. So there's a dual of sometime, which is always, so not sometimes not. If sometimes is redundant for this class of sentences, then always is going to be equally redundant, right? Assuming you have double negation elimination. And then you're going to have that always is redundant and then it's synonymous with sometimes. That seems not plausible. And in particular cases, it seems particularly not plausible. So, you know, there have been 5 mass extinctions. That's seems right. That's one of these have been. That's not what I meant to say. There are 5 mass extinctions, is what I meant to say. That's one of the sentences which doesn't have the tense stuff in it, right? It's just sort of talking about how things are like over the space-time manifold. 5 mass extinctions are in there. It's just not plausibly true that always there are 5 mass extinctions. In fact, it seems to be never the case that there are 5 mass extinctions in the tensity way that's sort of triggered by the presence of always there. Now, of course, these people are going to say, the fact that it says always there are 5 mass extinctions, the presence of always triggers a certain kind of interpretation on your part of that R as a tensed R. But of course, you shouldn't be doing that, right? So I don't think this is like any kind of knockdown objection. That's why it's counterintuitive rather than an actual argument. Here are some more. Here's the thing I guess I'm really worried about, is that it violates the spirit of compositionality. Not the letter. You can obviously cook up some function that says, you know, the semantic value of sometimes phi is blah when phi has a certain property and is something else when phi has a different property, right? That's can be compositional. It's more that I guess it would be desirable if once you know the meaning of sometimes, then you could combine it with whatever the meaning of phi turns out to be, and then you get the result. And in this case, it looks like sometimes contributes one thing to a complex sentence in which the semantic value of a complex sentence in which it appears, and sometimes it contributes something else. And you kind of have to wait until after you've heard the sometimes to hear what the next bit is before you can figure out what it is that it's going to contribute. And, you know, look, maybe we're all, you know, big fans of the context principle. Only in the context of the sentence does sometimes have any meaning. But I still think this is kind of ugly and yuck. In a sense, it sort of makes sometimes a context-sensitive expression itself, because sometimes when it occurs with the right complement, it expresses one thing, and when it occurs with a different complement, it expresses another thing. And that is a unusual and previously unattested form of context sensitivity. I don't want to put, does the embedded sentence contain tensed expressions as one of my new parameters of the context? That doesn't seem right. It also violates compositionality in a much more straightforward way, and I guess this is what I'm inclined to rest quite a lot on. Sometimes is obviously quantificational, right? It better have some kind of existential quantifier in its semantic analysis. You know, so what part of sometime do these redundancy theorists not understand? It also doesn't seem to help so much because we could introduce into our language a word sometimes, let's spell it sometimes with small caps, which behaves like sometimes is supposed to behave. It has the quantificational meaning in all contexts. We just run through the argument with this guy rather than the other guy. I don't see any less plausibility to any of the principles involved if you run through the argument with this other guy. And so we still would need to deal with this other kind of argument. I'm not sure the redundancy analysis exactly helps there. If the motivation I gave was a very B-theoretic looking motivation, right? It says, look, you're a B-theorist, you think all propositions are eternally true if true. Then you might think you can do something, there's a certain class of sentences which behaves like those guys, and then the sentence, the tense operator should be redundant when applied to them. If you're an A-theorist, you do not believe that about propositions. You do not think that every proposition is such that it's true eternally if true at all. And so it's I think it's a bit awkward to use that motivation for a redundancy analysis if you're an A-theorist. And this argument does target certain groups of A-theorists. Finally, I guess the redundancy theory works. This is kind of a wish list more than a real objection. The redundancy theory would provide symmetrical answers to both the modal and temporal versions of this problem. There's a striking fact, given these purported analogies between modal and temporal cases, that almost no one is a modal realist and almost many people are B-theorists. So it would be good to have a response, from my point of view, that enabled you to be a B-theorist, to deploy this kind of response to this objection to the B-theory, that didn't also lead you, by symmetry considerations, to deploying the same kind of response against objections to Lewis-style modal realism. So look, I think it would be nice if there was an asymmetry in the treatment of these two things. And so what I'm going to do in however much time I have left is talk about a response that meets these 6 objections, or hand waves in the direction of an objection. So reductionism, as I framed it previously, was explicitly in terms of achronal regions, moments of time. And that paralleled the modal case. You know, worlds are not modally extended. In fact, it's canonical for Lewis that worlds cannot be modally extended. Nothing is in 2 worlds. Worlds are modally maximal. Though Bricker has a kind of response that tinkers with that. And you know, different Lewis worlds are supposed to be alternatives to one another. So that motivates you probably for thinking that you shouldn't then try and glom them together, Frankenstein-like, into, you know, these 2 alternatives that are nevertheless supposed to be now representing a single alternative. That restriction looks plausible enough in the modal case, I think. It just doesn't look very plausible in the temporal case. It's very straightforward to put together different regions of time, different, you know, spatially maximal regions of time into longer regions of time, intervals, extended periods rather than mere instants. And different times are equally parts of reality. So it doesn't seem like there could be any problem with thinking that not only are things true of this, that, and the other instant, but things are also true at extended periods of time. So if you make intervals salient, as I just have, then you might think, well, why not deploy them in our temporal reductionism? Right, so here's temporal reductionism I, the interval version. It's annoying that instant and interval start with the same letter. There's a time t such that at t5, just in case there's a spatially maximal connected region, right? So it's space, it's connected, so it's not a scattered interval, but it may be temporally extended. And such that within it, phi, right? So we've liberalized from achronal regions to just bigger regions. And if you adopt that, what you get when you run through the problem with this guy in place of the original temporal reductionism is 9. There is an interval such that at least 2 maximal achronal regions within it exist. And that's as true. That's not in any way problematic or in any way an objection to the B-theory. And you can't start with at least 2 intervals as opposed to at least 2 maximal achronal regions, because again, you just get that there's an interval with 2 intervals. And depending on your assumptions about the structure of time, if it's continuous, then it's definitely going to be fine and not at all problematic to have that. Okay, so if you replace this instant-based version of temporal reductionism with an interval-based one, your problems go away. No, your problems go away in a way that they don't go away in the modal case. There's no, I think, plausible move paralleling this. Contra breaker. How much time?
10 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to skip this. Actually, no. This is somewhat important for the talk that I was planning on giving. So Dan Deasy, who's sort of pushed this kind of problem, he objects to the use of intervals because he says the standard B-theoretic account of truth simpliciter, which is namely that a sentence phi as uttered at t is true simpliciter, just in case phi is true relative to t, right? And he thinks relative to t, t's got to be an instant here. If it's not, you don't actually get any very clearly determinate truth conditions at all, because you could have, you know, here I am in an instant, something's true at this instant. Here I am in an interval where something's true, a bigger interval where something is, you know, where that very same thing is false. Right, instance, clear. There's just one, the one that I'm in. If you've got intervals, well, there's lots and lots of intervals that I'm in, and lots of different things might be true with them. Right, and so you wouldn't necessarily get good truth conditions, right? I guess my response to this is a very strange thing to claim is the standard B-theoretic account of truth condition, right? Only an A theorist would think that B theorists are signed up to this. Because the standard B-theoretic account of truth is you've got a sentence relative to a certain context, it expresses a proposition, the sentence is true just in case the proposition it expresses is true, not true relative to A, to some particular time t. So if you wanted to do this thing that Deasy is talking about here, there are ways of doing it. You could use interval temporal logics, or you could use interval semantics. These things exist. These things are more complicated than they should be. I don't think the B theorist should do that, right? The B theorist shouldn't be sort of playing, you know, trying to do B-theoretic tense logic. I just don't think that's a very ideologically sound thing for the B theorist to try and do. What they should do instead, and what most of them have done instead, is take predicates to feature covert temporal variables. And so when you say a sentence, what you end up doing is picking up either, you know, explicitly from the previous conversation, or deictically, or in some quantificational way, or just directly from the context, some temporal material that saturates your predicate, which has this otherwise unfilled argument place. And then what you end up getting, you don't do things tense logically, you do things in a kind of first order framework. Everything's kind of quantificational. So here's the kind of view that was very rapid. Here's the kind of view I'm talking about. This is Barry Taylor. So ostensibly n-place predicates of surface English capable of bearing tense inflections shall be represented by n+1 place predicates in first order paraphrase, with the extra place reserved for occupation by a singular term for a time. Tense is then to be accommodated by means of a system of predicates expressive of relations between times, along with indexical constants reproducing the surface now and then, right? Plus first order quantifiers that bind these things when appropriate. He talks about times, but he's very explicit. Times of two sorts will have to be acknowledged. Individual moments and longer temporal periods. Right? So he's talking about times, but he doesn't mean moments. He means times of all sorts. And this kind of approach, I mean, it's just first order logic. Of course, it plays very well with quantificational treatments of sometimes, always, and so on. So intervals avoid the problem, right? We've got a kind of logically straightforward way of thinking about it. The objection that Daniel raises about the use of intervals, I think, is a non-objection. It's a non-worry if B-theorists do things the way they're already inclined to do things. But is it ad hoc in some way to appeal to intervals? And I guess what I wanted to finish with was a bunch of arguments, a bunch of examples, particularly drawn from the literature on actions art and aspect, motivating the necessity of appeal to intervals in natural language semantics. So we need to use them anyway. We need to have them anyway. So it is no problem that our temporal reductionist appeals to intervals. In fact, it would be perverse if they did not. So here's this very rapid introduction to this kind of case. So very old discussion about the classification of verb phrases goes back to Aristotle. Here's a sort of modern version. So these are it's verb phrases that not perfect, because sometimes verb phrases, when you add extra stuff to them, can move from one aspect class to another. But here's the sort of a more or less good modern version. Some people put a fifth class of link type events, but we'll see this. So states, things that happen more or less for a long time and you stay in them relatively stably. So being a chicken, being a mountaineer, knowing something. Activities, walk, climb, swim. Accomplishments, cross the road, climb a mountain, draw a circle. These are sort of activities, drawing, climbing, crossing, followed by some sort of completion. And then there's also achievements, which are kind of the completions: dying, summiting, finding. Okay, so you can look for something, that's an activity. Finding it is an achievement, and finding your keys is an accomplishment. It's a kind of the whole process. All right. Aristotle's classification was a tripartite one. He didn't distinguish these third and fourth categories. There are a bunch of linguistic tests that are going to be important for us that tell you how to put a particular verb phrase in one of these categories. So statives versus non-statives. You can't put statives in the progressive, right? So Reinhold is or was knowing, or being a mountaineer, yuck, right? He is a mountaineer, fine. Is being a mountaineer, weird. Reinhold was climbing a mountain, summiting a mountain, all fine. Okay. So that gives us the first column. Activities versus accomplishments and achievements. So for activities, the past progressive entails the past simple. So Jonquil was talking, past progressive. Jonquil talked, right? You can't have been the case that she was talking without there being some interval at which it's true that she talked. The chicken was crossing the road, however, does not entail the chicken crossed the road. It's fine to say the chicken was crossing the road when it was unfortunately run over by a car and never gets to the other side at all. So it's not true that when you've got a crossing of the road that you have a successful achieved. When you've got some period of crossing a road, you don't end up necessarily having crossed it ever. Achievement's a bit different. You also have this distinction between what kind of adverbial modification is permitted. So activities demand for adverbials. So Jonquil talked for an hour, fine. Jonquil talked in an hour, weird. I mean, in the present, you can have in an hour meaning something like we'll be about to talk within, in an hour's time, but that's not the adverbial modification here. On the other hand, Sam found their keys for an hour. Strange. In an hour, better, right? Right. This whole thing of looking took an hour. Accomplishments can sort of commit both, it seems. So the need for intervals, I'm just going to stop, I think, here, or maybe I'll do one slide. Because there's a bunch of arguments that the right way to understand the role of aspect in and classification of verb phrases in these actions item is you need to appeal to intervals to do it properly. So here's the basic kind of case. So there's this distinction between telic and atelic predicates. The atelic one, and it's the same test that we saw before. So an atelic predicate is such that the past progressive entails the past simple. A telic predicate is not like that. So activities are atelic, accomplishments are telic. So telic is supposed to be suggestive of telos, goal-directed. Activities aren't goal-directed, they're just sort of things that are going on, whereas accomplishments, they definitely have this kind of achievement state that they're aiming towards. So how do we understand the progressive? Here's this view, Montague endorsed it, Dan Stott endorsed it. The present progressive X is phi is true at a moment. This is an instant-based semantics. It's true at a moment if X phi is true at every moment in the interval. Okay. And the simple interval version is it's true at an interval if it's true at the interval, right? If you're allowing things to be true at intervals, then it's fine. The problem is that this simple instant account of the progressive destroys this distinction between telic and atelic predicates. It's basically, it's the kind of thing you would cook up if all the examples you thought of were just activities. And the simple interval story does not, right? It does not entail that whenever you are phi-ing, whenever you were phi-ing, you have phi'd, unlike the simple instant version. It only does if the predicate in question has this property, the subinterval property. And basically it just says, if it's true at an interval, it's true at any sufficiently large subinterval. Right? And the idea is, lots of people, Bennett and Partee, Taylor, take the subinterval property to basically define the distinction between telic and atelic predicates. This is useful for our purposes because you can't even state the subinterval property if you have an instant-only based treatment of the times to which predicates are relativized. Okay, so this is kind of illustrative of the general class of examples. There's like 4 more examples of cases where you seem to require predicates to hold at intervals rather than just at instants to get the right kind of treatment, particularly of progressives. Distinction between progressives and perfects. I'll give one quick further case. Let's take this one, so 4 adverbial. So Antony worked on his slides for an hour. If predicates only take instant arguments, it seems like the best you can do is something like this. There are 2 times. They give you an interval of a duration of an hour. They're both before now. One is before the other, okay? And for every moment within that interval, then Antony worked on the slides at that moment, okay? But that's not how working on slides works, at least that's not how it works for me, right? There are many moments during the hour in which, well, more than 1 hour in which I was working on these slides, where I was not working on slides. Nevertheless, it's true that I worked on slides for an hour, or hiked up a mountain for an hour, or played piano for an hour. Like I do lots of things. Take a little break, take a breather, right? So it's totally fine. It would be perverse to say, no, you only climbed a mountain for 57 minutes because of those breaks that you took, right? That's just not, I don't know how natural language semantics works if you insist on that kind of thing. So Tichet puts it, for an interval to have a property is not the same thing as for each instant in the interval to have that property. So it just doesn't look like you can reduce properties of intervals to properties of instants within that. Right, so it looks like we're going to need intervals. We're going to need intervals to understand this. We're going to need intervals to understand the subinterval property and the distinction between telic and atelic predicates, verb phrases, sorry. We've got the, worries about imperfectivity. So given that you can cross a road without having achieved the crossing of the road, we better not have any kind of theory that entails you cross a road for, and it took an hour to cross a road entails you're crossing a road at every instant, because you'll end up having crossed the road. Okay, that was very quick, sorry. Intervals can also be the target for quantification. So Fritz always writes an article in less than a month. You can quantify over intervals, not just over instants. I conclude, therefore, We need intervals. We have independent need for quantificational constructions to be able to bind them. It's totally principled. Then to treat tense operators like sometimes, it was the case that, always, it will be the case that, all the other guys, as quantifying over extended intervals, as well as instants. Such a treatment blocks difficulties for the eternalist posed by this problem, particularly the B-theory eternalist. This treatment does not extend to the modal case because modal intervals don't seem to be things that we want or need. How should the eternalist A-theorists do it? Well, they probably have to do something funky. And the talk that I was going to give was about how that funky thing is actually difficult and it's much easier to be a B-theorist. But maybe next year I'll give that abstract instead of the one that I meant to give. Thanks.
A minute, agrees.
Yeah, so in the original argument against Lewis, it seems to me that there was this step where there was this move from P is true at W, P is true within W.
Yes, that is secured by Lewis reductionism.
Yes, exactly. And then you presumably there would be the same kind of move in sample case.
Mm-hmm.
Now my thought would be the following both cases, right? Would be you can move from sometimes, let's say, sometimes P to there's a time T at which P is the case. Okay? Now what's not correct necessarily is the last step. From that to there's time T within which P is true. And the thought being that, well, the within which operator requires you to restrict the quantifiers.
Yeah.
And then it will all depend on how the speaker is thinking about it. It's understanding and that's so perhaps like in natural language when people normally speak then they will, for them the inference would be okay because they would interpret in the sentences way. Whereas you should think so I would find that way of blocking the objection like interesting, plausible, rather than perhaps moving to
yeah, I guess I don't much like the idea that somehow when we go in the metaphysics room we stop talking English and start talking this made up new thing. I really lose my grip on the relevance of being in the metaphysics room. Well, the point of doing anything in the metaphysics room is that's what we're doing. So what I think would be nice, I hope, about the proposal is that it's stuff that we need anyway. It gives uniform semantic conditions for APT wherever it appears in the metaphysics room or outside it. Of course, in the metaphysics room, various domains of quantification are salient to us that are not salient to us outside the metaphysics room. So often it's not possible to do, once you've made, salient that according to your metaphysic, there are blue swans, they're just not any place relative to here. It's very hard to then, put that genie back in the bottle and restrict the quantifiers again. Okay, so this view predicts that would be hard because it gives you this kind of within a world, fine, but then once you've already drawn speakers and hearers' attention to the fact that there are places outside there, it's going to be harder to, at least immediately afterwards to restrict it again. Don't wait a minute and then people will start saying, there's no more beer, all that kind of stuff, the kind of normal examples. So I would prefer that to this kind of ambiguity thesis that you seem to be putting forward.
Thanks. A lot there in the last couple of earlier parts as well. I think I'm going to defend the standard or the more standard resolution because I'm worried just about failures of compositionality.
Yeah.
And I guess I thought that by the time we're trying to think as B-theorists or theorists of both things that are true at times and things that are true, simplicity of the whole block.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to go a bit funny. And I don't know if this is strictly speaking what you have in mind by these days. If I say things, that great theorist failure and dinosaurs, that's a bit odd. One is meant to be restricted to current time, the other is more general time. We applaud you that died, that's not bad, but more than we died, that's fine. So yeah, isn't the worry about the whole B-theoretic way of thinking about how we map from, say, sentences to proposition. The phase of compositionality happen at that level rather than because of the devices that are being introduced.
So I guess I'm not hearing why those would be failures of compositionality. I mean, I guess it's predicted compositionally that they will have a certain truth value, particularly if you're allowing intervals. There's also the pragmatic reasons why those things sound awful, but I don't think that's a problem with compositionality.
Okay, so you're thinking that. I'm inclined to say it's like there are dinosaurs is true. There's great theory of dinosaurs and it's false, and you want to deny that?
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, there's clearly an interval, a very large one, according to which the first conjunct holds somewhere within that interval, and the second conjunct holds somewhere within that interval. It's a very large interval.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if that's something to do with semantics here, but I guess.
I mean, if you don't have intervals, then it just turns out false on the B theory too, because there is no time such that both of those things.
Yeah, that's it. That's sort of what I was checking, as in, I wasn't sure exactly what. Okay, it's not my area. I wasn't sure what the compositionality you had in mind here.
All I'm really thinking is that wherever sometimes appears, it should contribute the same thing, not contribute different things.
Yeah, because it's always something like the contribution is different, but only because within, broadly B theory ways of talking, we treat our utterances very differently depending on whether they are about the whole block or ones that type.
Yeah, I don't think B theorists should or do that.
Okay.
I mean, except pragmatically, right? There's all sorts of pragmatic constraints that mean normally you restrict your attention to intervals that include intervals that are relatively small, such that intervals small enough that people moving, if I'm walking past you at a walking pace, I don't want an interval so big that relativistic stuff is going to start having an impact on whether you and I are talking about the same thing. There's all sorts of reasons why the intervals we consider are not all the intervals that there are. And then I think some of the cases that you're talking about give us a pragmatic weirdness because they're true, but only true relative to intervals, or true about intervals that are much larger than the intervals we expect to be talking about until I get this kind of, I have to accommodate, and accommodation feels weird and feels hard, and that gives us the yuck reaction. We just don't need it. I mean, I've got a story where the semantic value is kind of straightforwardly predictable, and we can see how the pragmatic story interacts with it, and predicts exactly the readings I think you're getting.
Yeah, because
it's not a semantic yuck; it's a pragmatic yuck.
This wasn't an objection to your proposal; it was just sort of defense of the standard one.
Thanks. So I like what you say about against the redundancy approach. I think that you're right in that. And also, I like you may be right about the need to introduce intervals anyway. But one minor point is that the last example that you've given, it could be analyzed, I think, adequately by means of instance, because you could say that Antony started. There's a time. Antony started to work on slides at T and finished working on slides at T prime. So without implying that you worked on slides continuously.
But then, so what? I better have some predicate, like worked on my slides at some point, and if it's got a temporal variable, what should it be, right? I mean, you could do things like it's not a universal. It's a generic quantifier, or it's a mostly quantifier, or something. But all those are going to give, I think, weird.
So the second point is, I think that the problem is really more general, so think about propositions like the number 2 is a prime number, right? So there is a sense in which this is supposed to be. So the B theorists will say, well, this is a tensor truth, obviously, but there's a sense in which this holds at every time. So at no time is it false that the number 2 is prime.
Yeah.
Right? So, but it can't really be a locational matter because intuitively number 2 is not located at any time at all.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a sense in which these operators, sometimes, always, and so on, and also the tensor operators, sort of ambiguity. I mean, on the one hand, we have some sort of locational phenomenon going on, being located at the time. And on the other hand, there's a sense in which things are true from the perspective of some time or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think in that case, I don't think there is any ambiguity. We just have the same quantificational reading of sometime. It's just that in those mathematical cases, it's very implausible to think there's any temporal variable slot on is prime. Right? And so it literally is redundant there, not because it means something different. It's just it does. There's nothing for it to bind. There's no free variable for sometime to is prime to bind in the predicate is prime.
It's not just ill form.
Sorry?
It's not just ill.
No, it's perfectly well formed. It's just, you know, you can stick a quantifier on the front of any sentence. Right? There may not be a variable for it to bind, but it's not ungrammatical. Formal language, like you can try and do it. It's very perverse to restrict the application of quantifiers to sentences in which the variable they contain is free. The formula, sorry.
Yes, my question is, what is your attitude to about physics? Because at the beginning of the direct consideration is strange because at the beginning of your talk you identified that representative with the yield, the initial problem that you presented. But then you argue that even modes are necessary for many different contexts and for solving the issue. But of course, not feel that there was are available to present it. But we started with an objection that was not able to consult presentation. We ended up with
Yeah, I guess the dialectic was it's supposed to be an objection to eternalist views, non-presentist views. Here's a response that non-presentists can make. It appeals to intervals. For independent reason to want intervals, that also turns out to be really bad for the presentists, which is good news for the family of views who are dialectically the target of the objection. So I think it's sort of a, you know, you respond to the objection, and as a bonus, you have a further argument against the crappy view that you were, the guys who are making this objection.
it's like a beneficial side effect.
Yeah, that's right. Just, you know, it's all gravy.
Yeah, could you go back to the slide where you give the conditions? The complements the modal, so that it was in terms of intervals, so it's like past tense things like
This guy?
yeah, so there must be something wrong. It seems to me.
Okay.
And the reason is that yeah, so okay, no, I see what that looks like. I'm supposed
Yeah, sorry, this is a bit typographically, there should be more spacing, I think.
Okay, so thanks again.